Hej och välkomna till podden Vertikala som produceras här vid Jönköping University. Mitt namn är Charlotta Melander och jag är professor i nationalekonomi här vid Handelshögskolan i Jönköping. Podden kommer att fokusera på under en rad avsnitt coronakrisen, pandemin som faktiskt berör oss alla i vår vardag. Även om inte alla forskarna här inne på något sätt håller på med virus och virusspridning så kan vi ändå se hur pandemin faktiskt påverkar stora delar av vårt samhälle på olika sätt. I det här avsnittet har jag därför valt att bjuda in min kollega Richard Florida som är professor vid University of Toronto. Richard och jag har i många år samarbetat och forskat kring städers utveckling och jag tänkte prata lite mer med honom om hur coronakrisen faktiskt påverkar våra städer idag men också hur de kan tänkas påverkas i framtiden. And I thought we could have as a starting point that we actually met 3 months ago in Miami. And this was right before the corona outbreak. And since then, clearly, both your life and my life has changed quite dramatically. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about how your life changed after the outbreak and how Miami responded to this.
Well, I'm probably like everyone. Because we didn't have a lot of information, I got just super anxious, like really, really badly anxious. I'm not an anxious person. And so that was very interesting to me, and probably as a result of uncertainty and also having two little kids and not knowing the score. So I was trying to take a little bit of a sabbatical. I was actually on sabbatical leave. I had decided in the transition of City Lab from the Atlantic to Bloomberg to take some time off from writing. Was actually starting to think about making a documentary project and talking to filmmakers and our public television stations here in the United States about making a documentary project on cities. And then, around the middle of March, say March 13th, roughly, we kind of realized, I think, across the world that the virus was significant. Maybe we overestimated that too. We sort of realized that. And so I immediately just threw myself into learning about pandemics and cities. And what's interesting about that is I never thought about it for a second. Like never once in a nearly 4-decade career as an urbanist thought about the role of pandemics or infectious disease in cities. I mean, I had heard that in response to earlier waves of sickness in cities, that there was attempts to build more parks or provide cleaner water or develop sanitation or put light building codes. They revised building codes for light and ventilation, but I never paid attention. I never studied it. Moreover, and this is an interesting personal note, I was born during a pretty significant pandemic in 1957 that killed 100,000 Americans, including infants. My parents never told me about that. And my parents, although they were born in the 1920s, my mom and dad were about the youngest in their families. So that means all of my aunts and uncles were either born during the Spanish flu or kids. No one ever mentioned those things to me. So I went back and I started to read a lot about the role of pandemics and infectious disease and really spent like 3 weeks or 4 weeks trying to grapple with this and trying to make sense of it. And I think, I'm finally, my essay on this is going to come out in a couple of weeks when City Lab is now formally relaunched as a part of the Bloomberg family. But I started to write a whole bunch on this stuff. So I think I've learned something.
And I know since we met, you have relocated to Toronto. And did Toronto react differently from Miami? I mean, you've changed location once during this pandemic.
Yeah, that was no fun, for sure. Changing locations during the pandemic was no fun. And arranging flights across an international border was no fun. And literally yesterday, we got out of quarantine. So yesterday, which was Monday, June 1st, for folks listening in, our 2-week quarantine ended and we could, I have a house, so we could go in the backyard and, we could be outside and the weather's nice in Toronto. So it wasn't like terrible, but we could go finally for a walk through our beautiful ravine system in Toronto. But it's interesting, people made a lot of noise about Miami and Miami Beach, and I actually helped the mayor a lot, was on the committee on reopening and recovery in Miami Beach. I think Miami handled it pretty well. Everyone saw the pictures of, the kids on the beach. And I think we know that, that wasn't great, but we know that the virus doesn't really transmit outside. I went for a walk every day. I tried to socially distance, but occasionally someone crossed my path. It was hard in a condominium because you have no common activities. You can't use a swimming pool. You can't use a gym. Fortunately, we have a little balcony. We could go for walks. But I think Florida played it pretty well. And what the governor there did, even though he's a Republican and I didn't support him, I'm a Democrat, he secured the old age homes and the nursing homes and created teams of people who would go to the old age homes and nursing homes and grade them. And if they weren't up to par, relocate people. So we didn't have the deaths in the nursing homes that we might have. And of course, because it was hot and warm and people could get outside, Florida was okay. Toronto's more of a lockdown mentality, and Toronto is just that way. We still, the city's pretty closed down. I mean, you can go for a walk and actually, if you wanted to go to a store, I haven't gone, by the way, I haven't gone to a grocery store or pharmacy since March 13th. So everything here has been able to be delivered. But if you wanted to go to a retail store in Toronto, you would have to make an appointment and go at a designated time. But, why do I really want to go to a retail store? And of course, in contrast to you, in Sweden, I haven't been able to go to the office. So I set up a little home office here. I mean, the other big difference is in Miami, we have a condominium, so I didn't have a home office. And I have 2 little kids. And so that was kind of funny. But here we have a house, so I have a home office. And by the way, you know me, I am kind of a remote worker, introvert anyway. So I have always tended to work at home. And in a way, this just feels like an extension of my regular life. And I mean, I hate to say there's a silver lining, but I've always hated to go out to events or to parties. And not going to events and parties has been a benefit. And then not having to travel. I mean, sometimes I miss it, but at the end of the day, I get to spend more time with my kids. So, it could be a lot worse.
And you touched upon it, and I know you've been updating yourself quite a bit on it, but the Swedish strategy, because in Sweden now, we have clearly been way more open than the rest of the world, but now with slightly higher death rates than many other countries, we have a community here that screams pretty loud and who would like to have a lockdown and who would like us to be more strict. I'd just like to hear your take on this.
So, through you and through my reading, I followed the Swedish strategy pretty closely. I think it's the best possible strategy. I'm not saying it's perfect. And obviously, your public health minister and officials have admitted you could have done better with the nursing homes and old age homes. But, when I first learned about the Swedish strategy and you and I became talking about it, I read all the interviews and watched the online interviews with your current public health minister and then his predecessor. It was very interesting because it was a more general public. I think public health today, at least in the United States and Canada and much of Europe, is a very narrow definition of public health. It's mitigating, it's a 19th century definition, mitigate infectious disease, impose social and physical distancing and lockdown, and protect healthcare system capacity. That's it. Any other dimension of health, broader mental health, broader physical health, economic health and well-being is not considered. And when I listened to your public health authorities, they mentioned right away that it wasn't so much about mitigating the disease, that the disease would have a progression. And even if you lock down, it would come back. So it was going to have a toll. And of course, in this disease, the toll is mainly on older people, not only on older people, but mainly. It's not very contagious among children. And it's hard to say whether children make it contagious or make it contagious for adults. But what they said is it wasn't just about keeping the economy solid. It was creating a sense of social normalcy. And, I said to you and I said to some of our other colleagues, what I was worried about in the United States was the fraying of the social fabric, that in such a divided and polarized country with an inflammatory president in Trump, that our social fabric would decay. And I thought more about like what we call so-called Michigan militia, right-wing populist violence as a result of the lockdown. I was less worried about urban unrest, but also worried about urban unrest. And I think the Swedish strategy shows its stripes, if you will, shows its worth because of the unrest we're experiencing in the United States now. I think that not to say that wasn't simmering, that it wasn't a result of police brutality. It was a long-term result of economic inequality, class inequality, racial inequality. But the lockdown kind of created the tinderbox or powder keg So in that sense, I think the Swedish strategy is the best possible one. By the way, I'll note that Florida's strategy was not dissimilar from the Swedish strategy. We never locked down the state. Cities could impose their own measures. And Miami Beach, I think, was a little bit too stringent because the virus really didn't hit Miami Beach. But the state was able to, its communities craft their own strategy while the state focused on the old age home. So, yeah, and I think, don't you think most places are now moving towards a Swedish strategy? I mean, as we reopen, more and more places look like they're emulating something like the Swedish strategy. And moreover, it's very interesting what's coming out of Italy now. Now, you don't know if this is true, but you're hearing the reports of the Italian virologist saying, look, it looks like the virus has lost potency, that it was very potent to begin with and horrific. But now if they're checking the people in Italy who are catching it, it doesn't look as, it looks, it doesn't look great, but it doesn't look as bad as it was. So, yeah, I think the Swedish strategy was the best possible one. And as time goes on, I think that's becoming more evident.
Like you and I have been focusing on cities ever since I got to know you almost, 16, 70 years ago. And clearly cities, like big cities, have been hit the hardest in the US. I mean, New York has been hit the hardest in the US so far. In Sweden, Stockholm is clearly hit the hardest. So do you think that was by default that big, dense cities would be hurt the most in this crisis?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's clear that, some of these cities had a lot of travelers, they have a lot of tourists, they have a lot of immigration, they have a lot of back and forth. It's unclear to what degree density spreads the virus per se, because of course, San Francisco is the second densest city in the United States and has very little spread. It's hard to say also in New York to what degree the subway. I mean, there's an economist at MIT who's a very capable guy who said the subway was a main spreader. It looks like this disease is spread by super spreaders. It's not spread as much by individuals. It's super spreaders that really do it. And, the preponderance of the spread is in household environments. So I guess New York has a lot of multi-generational households. It is very diverse socioeconomically. It is not as gentrified of a city as San Francisco. So I think density is one factor. I mean, it's certainly, not to be too technical, but you and I can be, or at least you can be. I mean, in Jed Kolko's pretty reasonably good regressions at the county level, he finds density to be positive and significant, even controlling for other factors. So density is a factor, but overcrowding, where you have a lot of overcrowding and a lot of poverty, they are factors. Weather and climate, he finds positive and significant. Colder, drier climates, winter climates. Age, of course, is a big factor. And then you can add health and fitness, the fact that San Francisco has mainly young people. It's a city that was been very expensive and families have been pushed out. And I think those factors probably matter more than either density or lockdown. The other thing is that we've seen this disease spread now in rural areas in the United States pretty aggressively. And in particular, it's spread in enclosed environments, churches, funeral homes, and then the meatpacking factories, which have been big deals. And then, as you know, because we've talked about this, because you mentioned it in the case of Sweden, a lot of this virus spread through ski slopes, and both in the French and Italian Alps, but also in Colorado. So very interesting, not on the slope per se, but in the lodge and the buffet areas. So yeah, I think that density has been a factor, but not a huge one. And my hunch is, what you probably do is you take stringent measures where the outbreaks are, and you don't impose stringent measures where the outbreaks aren't. If you have to take a stringent measure in New York, do so. The other thing that's really interesting in that is there's been a study done of the Mission District in San Francisco, which is a pretty diverse neighborhood, a neighborhood that was quite poor, but now has been gentrified. The tech community has moved in. And these epidemiologists at one of the universities and their graduate students went out on the street and really tested people, both for the virus and for the antibodies. They did a sample of thousands of people. And what they found was the virus was overwhelmingly concentrated among frontline workers, delivery workers, retail workers, grocery workers, transit workers. And you couldn't find a remote worker, professional worker who had it. And it was overwhelmingly concentrated among Black and Latino minorities. You couldn't hardly find an Asian or Caucasian person who had it. that's saying something, that this is a disease that's not only propagated by age, but is propagated by poverty and class. And its differential impact by socioeconomic class has been just horrendous. So yeah, it is a disease that really targets, even Joel Kotkin, my erstwhile enemy who's now become a friend, said to me, the real disease here is poverty. And, so people are waking up to the fact that, and I think that's been a factor why perhaps Sweden has not been quite as bad as the United States. I think where you've had endemic poverty and pre-existing healthcare conditions that go along with poverty, you've had been worse hit.
One thing that's been said to me over and over again over the last weeks is that this could, or maybe asked rather, if this could be the end of urbanization, the things we're witnessing now. That because the strength of cities is the density. We're being close to others, and social distancing suddenly becomes something that we try to sort of live with instead, and then we sort of lose a little bit of the values of being in a city. So what's your take on that?
So I think cities will be fine. This essay that I've written 2 months ago and is finally going to come out in the middle of June basically makes that case, and I'll make sure you get the first link to it. But I think, the fact that I've never thought about infectious disease, and remember, the plagues in Europe took out 40 to 50% of the population of cities in the 14th and 15th centuries. The cholera epidemic in London wiped out huge segments of the London population. Even the Spanish flu in the United States in 1918 took out hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of America, and hit infants and hit prime age workers. Now, this is terrible, don't get me wrong, but this is nothing to compare to those. And those did not really stop the force of urbanization. If they did, I would have learned about it. So urbanization, the positive effects of density, of commingling of people, of ideas, of knowledge on productivity and innovation is a far stronger force. That said, there'll be some effects. And I think it's less the effects of the disease per se, more the effects of the economic and social fallout. So here's what I think might happen. I think what we've seen in the United States, certainly much more than Canada, and I don't know the case in Europe, is an acceleration of what I've always called family formation moves. In the United States, when people have kids, unless they're extremely wealthy or extremely risk oblivious or willing to take on undue burdens, they tend to move from the central city. They go to the central city when they're young to pursue a career, to get good job opportunities, to develop a professional network, and to find friends and partners, mating markets. When they not only marry, but when they have, say, 1 kid or 2 kids, and that kid gets to be 3, 4, or 5, they then begin to look at other moves to suburbs because our school system is so unequal here, where schools are better and where they can get more space. What this pandemic has done is accelerated those family formation moves that might have been made over the course of, say, 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, 5 years into 2 or 3 months. So everyone I know who left Manhattan fits, there's not a single person I know who's left Manhattan who doesn't fit that profile. Young kids, pregnant, kid on the way. If you look at the number of people who had mail forwarding addresses, and I had our friend Karen King, our colleague Karen King, check my calculations, so I know they're right, who forwarded their direct mailing address from New York City in the past 2 to 3 months, 1.6% of the population have done so. The vast preponderance to New York City suburbs. It's less than 0.5% that have gone to another metro area, whether that's Miami, Los Angeles, Boston, or Washington, D.C. So I think that you're going to see some movement of families out of, and also of rich people. I think the pied-a-terre dweller, the foreign wealthy buyer, the 65-year-old suburbanite who would have come to a city like New York or London will say, to heck with that. So cities will get younger. What we know from the history of past pandemics is that young people flock to cities because wages go up, the wage premium rises, that to establish careers, if travel restrictions stay in place, finance industries, media industry, high-tech industries will probably concentrate even more in the superstar metros. Now, they may set up suburban office parks to capture some of the workers who work out in the burbs. But I think on net, cities will get younger. And I don't think we're going to see a big shift And then, let's say this runs for another 2 years, maximum 18 months to 2 years. Then I think things will go back to the way they were. I think fear of transit will remain. I think we're going to have to be concerned with traffic congestion. I think one of the big lasting effects of the pandemic will, interestingly enough, be bike lanes. I think that, this has been something also that's been brewing. But yes, there'll be more bike lanes. Maybe we'll fix up the parks. I mean, that seems to be what happens in the wake of other pandemics. We get better parks and open space, better ventilation, more open windows. But I think people will go back to the office eventually. I don't think, some people like me will want to work remotely. But especially if you're working in a big city like London or Paris or New York and you're young and you have roommates, you kind of need an office. There's no place else to work. So yeah, I think, and then, look, the United States is a special situation with Trump in office, which is quite unique. I do think Trump will lose. I mean, that doesn't mean hope. I mean, I think Biden has a sizable lead. And so by next January, things will get back to more of a normalcy. But yeah. And I mean, I think the biggest issue for cities in the United States, in contrast to Canada or Europe, is that cities are going to have a hard time financially. That the pandemic is going to hit hard at their budgets. They're going to have to make service reductions. That's going to make maybe quality of life erode. And I think the unrest, it creates an uncertainty. Now, I don't think that unrest will go on forever. I do think we'll get a new federal administration that will be more healing. But yeah, a summer of unrest combined with fiscal stress is going to hit. But no, it won't kill cities. At the end of the day, our cities will survive. But this will be a difficult period.
Can it cause some kind of rural revival, do you think?
Well, I think one of the things we're seeing now is, instead of people making a classic suburban move, which was, my parents moved from Newark, New Jersey. By the way, a city that had terrible riots when I was a boy, and that those riots are why I'm an urbanist. I witnessed them as a 9 or 10-year-old, which has done very good at re-educating its police, community involvement, and has had very little violence. It has had protests, but it hasn't had violent eruptions. So I'm very proud of my city. My parents moved from Newark, New Jersey in the 1960s to an outlying suburb. Most people in that period of suburbanization moved from a center city, New York or Boston or Washington or Los Angeles, to an outlying suburb. The new group of moves is, of course, suburban. I already said that. Most of the moves out of Manhattan and Brooklyn have been to the outlying suburbs. But now people, because they can remote work, can look more broadly. So many more people are saying, I prefer a quieter rural place. And in the US, I know less about Sweden, but our history of creativity is that creative people in the US, artists and musicians, have always either gone urban or rural. And, we had that great Woodstock festival in the 1960s, in 1969. Well, the reason that festival occurred in a rural part of New York, outside of the city, up along the Hudson Valley, is because Michael Lang, who promoted that festival, was actually asked to come to Woodstock. He was a musical promoter, and he owned a big recording studio in New York City, in the Village. They asked him to come to Woodstock because people like Bob Dylan and the band and other musicians were already, and of course the great painters, the abstract painters, were already out in Woodstock. Hudson Valley painters are a big part of US history. So there has always been a creative group. Tim Wojin of the US Department of Agriculture, formerly of the US Department of Agriculture, has studied and found there's about 100 or so rural creative outposts in the United States, with large concentrations of artists and musicians and performers. So yeah, I think we're seeing that again. And, certainly many of the people who left New York City are going to places like the Hudson Valley. Many of the people who left Denver went to the rural outpost of Colorado. Same thing in California. So I think that's occurring. I'm not sure it's enough to revive rural places, but yeah, and I think the other place people are going is to smaller metros. So I've been working with the Kaiser Family Foundation in Tulsa. They have a program they call Tulsa Remote, which provides a small grant, but provides civic and social capital, which introduces you to the community, builds a community of workers and friends, helps you find an affordable house. Yeah, they've seen a surge of applications. And when I went to Tulsa, I'd find people from New York and San Francisco and Chicago and Atlanta and Dallas who moved there. But yeah, so I think it's stretched where people can move. So yeah, I think we're going to see more of that. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, our time is running out, but I thought, I know when this is over, I'm going to be get phone calls again, asked to go out and give speeches about how to recover from the pandemic. So I thought that you may be able to help me a bit. What would you
So
recommend places to
that's
focus?
all my work is, as you know, that's what my work has been on more than even intellectual writing, because I'm old enough now and have a pretty developed network of cities. So I'm working with Tulsa, Northwest Arkansas, which is Bentonville, Fayetteville, we're the University of Arkansas, New York City with the comptroller of New York City, who's likely to run for mayor, Newark, New Jersey, Denver with the mayor directly, Philadelphia, and a variety of cities. First, I began with my colleague, Stephen Pedigo, who's much more applied than I am, who's now runs the urban lab at the University of Texas, LBJ School, to say we have to look beyond immediate mobilization of healthcare capacity and economic and financial capacity. We have to make a reasonable reopening strategy. We have to start to think about how to prepare our airports, large-scale civic assets, convention centers, how to reopen small businesses, which don't have the capacity to understand how to physically distance or to develop healthcare interventions, or the arts and creative economy. How do we develop programs to create capacity there? But our work now is really on how do you create a just and inclusive and resilient recovery. And I think this is really imperative. You know, the last book I wrote was called The New Urban Crisis, which talked about the incredible divide in our cities between rich and poor and the isolation of poor communities away from the areas of concentrated disadvantage, and how this was questioning the long-term viability of cities. I think this is all the more urgent. So we've been trying to make the case, working with people like HRNA Advisors, a big economic development consulting firm in the United States, working with mayors and city leaders. You know, and I said this in 2001. Remember, I was in the middle of writing Rise of the Creative Class in 2001. And again in 2008, when I wrote a big essay for The Atlantic and wrote The Great Reset, I said, you know, one of the things I said was this would give us a reprieve. Cities were becoming expensive and divided. These crises would give us a time to reset ourselves and to address these problems. And in fact, people criticized me and said, you know, it's all going to go to the suburbs. Cities are dead. Cities will be annihilated. You're over. And in fact, I underestimated. If you asked me to introspect, I would say the thing I got most wrong was the fact I underestimated the veracity and ferocity of the urban revival that would occur in the wake of those crises. So I think we have a limited window now, especially with the combination of the COVID crisis, the economic or recession or depression, and burgeoning civil unrest, to really put a just and inclusive and resilient recovery, safer, healthier, more equitable on the agenda. And, you know, I'm hoping that our mayors, because in the United States, we don't have a federal government, we have a dysfunctional federal government, our mayors can lead that. And maybe in the United States, you know, the Biden administration, I just tweeted about this morning, could lead an effort to give cities more power and more fiscal power to address their problems and provide more spending to heal these divides. But yeah, I think it's job one is really but you know, I've said that before, and I'm not overly, I mean, I'm hopeful, but I'm not overly optimistic. In the past, what happened is we went through these crises, periods, and convulsions, and cities just kept going the way they were going and becoming less equal, more divided. So I hope this is our wake-up call. By the way, before we quit, I think the biggest implication of this crisis has got to be a rethink of the public health profession. I think the public health profession has really failed us, and I don't say that lightly. And I don't think it's their fault. I think it's our fault too. You know, when I started the School of Cities at the University of Toronto, one of the things I really wanted to do was bring together not only computer science and technologists with urbanists, but public health, because we have very good public health people. They're quoted all over the place, epidemiologists. And I said, why don't we bring them together? And it's really hard to do. But I think what we need now is not just public health officials making these decisions. We need multidisciplinary teams of urbanists, economic developers, economists, crisis interventionists, disaster recovery specialists. Really, we need a new approach to public health, which weighs not only the short-term propagation of disease and healthcare capacity, but looks at mental health, larger social health, economic health, in a comprehensive way, and does that in real time. So I think that's where we need to get, and uses technology to help us get there. So, you know, I don't say this lightly either. In a way, we are lucky that this COVID-19 virus is as it is. this could be a far deadlier, more lethal virus that is contagious. I mean, AIDS alone has killed more than 30 million people. Ebola, this could be worse. And maybe, I hate to call it a silver lining because every death is horrific. And what may transpire in the global south may be worse, but maybe this is the freaking, wake-up call that we need, that says, people have been warning us about pandemics and infectious disease, that these are the kind of shocks that can really hurt our society in deep ways. Maybe we need to wake up and develop a better capacity to make our cities more resilient and just and inclusive so that they can respond better. And I hope that's what we learn from this. By the way, crises always provoke dystopias. I mean, it's amazing how dystopian gloom and doomers come out of the woodwork. And, over time, reality, and what tends to happen is that crises do not disrupt our society. They tend to accelerate changes already underway. Movement of families to the suburbs, movement of young people to the cities, increase in remote work, an increase in remote learning. And I think that'll be the case here. This will accelerate some changes already underway. But if we look back in this in a decade, we're going to see more continuity than disruption. And hopefully we'll take the strategic and intentional interventions now that will allow us to build more just, more inclusive and resilient cities and suburbs and rural areas. So that's my hope. And that's what I'm trying to work on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard, for taking the time and joining me here. And it was so informative. I mean, I'm just looking forward to all the research that we can do once this is over and done with.
Yeah, thank you. And
that in place.
Yeah, well, we're working on this with our team, and I have the essay coming. And then, fortunately, with two great friends, Mike Storper and Andres Rodriguez Pose, we're trying to do a big kind of historical review of the role of pandemics in cities. And we all agree. I mean, it's funny how so many of us take different perspectives, but we all agree, that we can beat this thing. So yeah, I think we're going to do more. And like you said, I think it's going to be interesting when we come out of this to get back out there and see people out in cities and communities and provide a little inspiration. I think that's one of the things our work has done. It's not Pollyannish, but it provides an inspiration to say that we can build better cities. And I think I think we can do it. It's gonna take a while. We have to build more capacity, but we'll get there.